This week, the 54th World Economic Forum will be held in Davos, that's in Switzerland, attended by world leaders, titans of industry and civil society. Africa succeeded in gaining permanent membership in the G20 last year, and this year it's attempting to gain permanent seats at the UN Security Council. Here at home, Finance Minister Inoko Dongwana is hoping to attract foreign investment for the electricity transmission network. But will South Africa be an easy sell to investors given the current geopolitical context? Let's unpack this with development economist Dr. Jason Musyoka, who joins us via our video link this morning. It's great to have you on the program as always, Doc. Thanks very much indeed for making time. You know, I wonder if you reckon there is enough of a kind of coherent and cogent discussion about what world development looks like in our current context, given the many different things that are competing for our focus, so to speak.
So I think that there are some global multilateral bodies such as the World Economic Forum and others that have tried to bring together the crises that are going all over the world and try to synthesize this. So as far as the World Economic Forum is concerned, there has been, so there's a global risk report that's released just on the eve of the forum, and it tracks broadly 5 major issues around the world and how the world is faring in terms of risk assessment. And these issues include your technology, they include society, for example, demographic change that we are seeing around the world, they include climate change, geopolitics, and geoeconomics. So the current report that has just been released in anticipation to the forum in Davos this coming week cites that climate change is the dominant crisis or dominant risk that the world over is going to be experiencing. That's interesting because it's interesting and it's also not necessarily surprising. Part of the reason is because last year we had the same risk as at the top of the list, and now we have the same. But having said that, climate change is also one of the issues that is contested for a range of reasons, not least, political interests and technological information and disinformation. But nevertheless, it is the dominant risk that the Global Risk Perception Survey has indicated as we are going to grapple with in the next 10 years.
I find that incredibly interesting because I certainly haven't come across many discussions in the public sphere, so to speak, that focus on climate change as the threat that you've kind of framed it as now. I mean, occasionally there'll be a statement from the Pope, perhaps Joe Biden will say 1 or 2 things, but I still don't get a sense that there's this galvanizing of the important voices of important leaders in order to ensure that there's this clear plan of how to tackle, for instance, something like how the climate is changing.
No, there isn't. There's no harmonized perspective. And part of that is because of the fact that we are living in an era of social media. And if you look at the broader debate around social media, we really are talking about artificial information, AI, technologies, and so on. So that has created this kind of schism that you see with a lot of information, misinformation, disinformation. It's difficult to really pick where is the fact or the realities exactly. And unfortunately, these kinds of disinformation and misinformation have been elevated to government levels, international levels. And therefore, talking to the point that you just made, that has created alternative realities where you have evidence that is presented with as far as climate denialists are concerned. They have evidence to suggest that, except that that evidence is not necessarily backed up by science, but it's believed in public. Then you have, of course, those that are presenting evidence about climate change, which is, again, the argument is that it's undeniable. Adding to that technological context, there is also the geopolitics. And the geopolitics for us here in South Africa, for example, the fact that there is a lot of pressure on South Africa and other emerging economies to move quickly towards renewable energy. But the argument, the geopolitical argument goes like this, but developed countries developed on the back of non-renewable energy. Now they're demanding that we skip our opportunities for industrialization. So that geopolitical debate is also very consequential in guiding conversations around climate change.
Yeah, speaking about consequential dynamics between the northern and southern hemisphere, I think it'll be remiss of us not to touch on the many different geopolitical issues that are plaguing the world, the number of wars that are currently playing out. I mean, South Africa, for instance, has been making headlines for its bold move to take Israel to the ICJ. That, in many instances, has been seen as this kind of bold step taken by the global south against these hegemonic powers from the global north, right? You have a whole lot more countries speaking out against the West, for example, and one wonders how these things will play out at the World Economic Forum, because as we know, in many instances, issues around the economy can very seldomly be separated from politics.
Indeed. I've always argued that we've had, the world has moved from a unipolar world when we used to have one hegemony that is dominating the world, that would have been the US in the last 50 or 60 years or so, to a bipolar, which is Russia coming into the fray, and this is during the Cold War, now to a multipolar world which has different centers or different axes, if you like, where you have now China, and then you have Russia, and then you have the US, of course, and Europe is also trying to carve their niche. So we are living in a moment of fragmentation around the world without any single dominant power. The risk of that is that everybody tries to flex their muscles. India, by the way, also comes into the picture. So with all of that, you can see countries like South Africa and China. South Africa knows, for example, a good example is Uganda, where they were kicked out of AGOA, and they said, we are happy to go without being part of AGOA, because China will easily cover that space that US was covering as far as trade is concerned. So this is to say that a lot of emerging economies, the global south in particular, they are seeing China as an alternative. And as far as economic support is concerned, it has been an alternative from at least about 2011. And therefore, this is creating these kinds of boldness that you're talking about, where countries feel like they do not have to be confined to the U.S. interests only. They can really diversify and be much more vocal around their own issues.
Are we better off because of that, Dr. Musiaka? Perhaps there might be growth pains as we transition to that space, but in an ideal world, is it better to have a single center of power, or do people generally in the long run benefit more when there are multiple centers?
So very interestingly, if we look at history, the better option always is when you have one power that is dominant. The reason is, except that you expect that power to be benevolent, right, and democratic. But in a multipolar world, because it's a fragmentation that has happened, you're likely to see even there's no deterrent and constraints. So countries are very likely to go into conflicts because there's no deterrent. And that is really a risk that I think that we are going into. If you look at the time that the UK was dominating the world as the hegemony, and then, of course, handing over power to the US, and now we are in that transition moment. There's no doubt a lot of analysis is suggesting that this is China's century. You're going to see probably in the next 40, 50 years, China rise as the hegemony. But during this moment of transition, the fragmentation can potentially cause a lot of conflicts, which is why you see Russia is much more bolder to take over Ukraine. China itself is talking about Taiwan in a much more bolder way than it was before, because they know that the U.S. cannot contain Russia and China at the same time. They don't have the capacity and support Israel at the same time. So this kind of transition is much more riskier, and history points to the fact that it can cause potential conflicts around the world.
Sure, fascinating. During arguments at the ICJ this past week, just to point at that as one instance of very interesting geopolitical dynamics, there was a comment passed, I think it was by the South African team, around how a lot of how the court decides will have a bearing on multilateralism generally. And I think so many more people are starting to have that kind of discussion about whether or not multilateralism, as envisioned by the precepts of the United Nations and many other transnational organizations, works. Do you expect that to have any kind of bearing on the World Economic Forum? Because this is yet another multilateral platform where, as I mentioned, world leaders, titans of industry are set to come together. Do you reckon they walk into that kind of setting a whole lot less confident about how working together as a global community actually might work?
So that's a fascinating question, and I think that the World Economic Forum team that was organizing the thematic areas of focus, they foresaw the possibility of creating these kinds of tensions and we've seen that in debates and discussions around global issues such as climate change and politics and so on. So they picked up technological advancement as the theme to talk about. I think that, in my view, is very deliberate to avoid talking about issues that might divide. It doesn't help us much, of course, to avoid the problem. But I think that there is what seems to me an effort to try and avoid the more contentious issues. But to go back to your question more directly, I think that one needs to, if we go back to the point I made also earlier, which links to your question, is that the UN itself is also experiencing that change because traditionally the US has huge, enormous veto power. That is beginning to change with other economies emerging, and with the multipolarism, you're beginning to see the US becoming much more diverse, much more democratic, and much more vocal against the West itself, which is currently the main funder. So I think that the UN is likely to also experience the kind of turbulence that we are looking at, but potentially become much more equal platform of bargaining even for Global South.
Dr. Jason Musyoka, as always, very great speaking to you and getting your insights. Do appreciate your time on Newzroom Afrika. Dr. Musyoka is a development economist. Once again, thanks very much indeed.